Ever wondered what it was really like to be a Roman gladiator? Not the Hollywood version with slow, motion sword fights and dramatic speeches, but the actual, historical, sweat-soaked, bone-breaking reality. In this video, we're diving into the brutal, bloody, and often absurd world of Rome's most famous fighters. No fiction, no fluff, just 2 hours of pure, historically recorded misery, served with a side of dry humor to help it go down easier. And before we begin, if you enjoy these kind of history narration videos, please take a moment to subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, let's begin. Welcome to ancient Rome. Marble temples, roaring crowds, emperors drunk on power. The streets are paved with ambition and sewage. Senators argue in togas, while slaves sweep up after their sandals. The Colosseum towers above the city like a stone colander of chaos, promising blood, spectacle, and overpriced snacks. Gladiators are the main event, part celebrity, part property, part cautionary tale. They're trained to entertain, to bleed on cue, and to die with flair. The crowd cheers, the emperor waves, and somewhere, a lion is wondering why it skipped breakfast. But deep below the cheering, there's the dirt of the arena floor. Not marble, not gold, just sand. Coarse, stained. It's where the real show happened. Far from the polished columns and philosophical debates about virtue and wine taxes. This was Rome's favorite blood-soaked sandbox, where men with names like Phrixus or that one guy with the limp were tossed in with swords, nets, and the occasional wild animal, all for the entertainment of a crowd that considered death by trident a solid afternoon. The arena floor was a stage, sure, but not the kind where you forget your lines. Forget your footing here, and your tomorrow's opening act in the clean up with a shovel segment. The sand wasn't just for traction. It was there to soak up blood, sweat, and the occasional tooth. It was the Roman version of carpet, absorbent, replaceable, and always hiding something unpleasant underneath. Above, the crowd roared. Below, the fighters grunted, gasped, and occasionally screamed in Latin. The emperor might give a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or just be distracted by a snack. Either way, your fate was decided by someone who hadn't broken a sweat since toga season. This wasn't sport. It was spectacle. It was theater with a body count. It was Rome's favorite way to say, "We conquered the world, and now we're bored." A place where men fought, bled, and died for sport. And if you were lucky, you got a nickname. If you were really lucky, you got to keep your limbs. Nicknames were everything. The Thracian, the Butcher of Bai, Lefty, which, ironically, meant you'd lost your right arm. These weren't just stage names. They were survival badges. If the crowd remembered you, you might get better armor. If the crowd loved you, you might get to live. And if the crowd forgot you, well, then you were just another stain in the sand. Gladiators weren't all slaves, but most were. Some were criminals. Some were prisoners of war. A few were volunteers. Yes, actual Roman citizens who signed up for the fame, the thrill, or the promise of a better life. Spoiler, it rarely ended well. The moment you stepped into the ludus, the training school, you stopped being a person and started being a product. You were fed, trained, and branded like livestock. Literally branded, with hot iron. Because nothing says career change like a third-degree burn. Training was brutal. You didn't just learn to fight, you learned to perform. You practiced with wooden swords, twice as heavy as the real ones, so that when the time came, your arms wouldn't betray you. You learned how to fall dramatically, how to die convincingly, and how to make eye contact with the emperor while bleeding from the spleen. It was theater, but with more concussions. And the gear, it wasn't standardized. It was themed. You might be a murmillo with a fish-shaped helmet and a short sword, or a Ricciarius with a net and trident. Basically the Roman version of guy who brought a fork to a sword fight. The matchups were designed for contrast, spectacle, and maximum betting potential. Because nothing says civic pride like wagering on who gets disemboweled first. The crowd didn't care about fairness. They cared about flair. They wanted drama. They wanted blood. They wanted to see a man lose a fight, a limb, or his last shred of dignity. And then maybe get a thumbs up if he looked cool doing it. It looked like glory. But for the gladiator, it was sweat, terror, and sand in every wound. And the sand never forgot. The arena didn't care how noble your cause was. It didn't care if you were once a general, a farmer, or a guy who just stole the wrong loaf of bread. Once you stepped onto that sand, you were a gladiator, and that meant pain was part of the costume. The crowd saw the armor, the weapons, the dramatic poses. They didn't see the infected cuts, the broken ribs, or the fact that your helmet smelled like fear and last week's loser. Every fight was a gamble. Not just with your life, but with your dignity. You could train for months, survive a dozen matches, and still get taken out by a guy with a net and a lucky throw. And if you lost, well, maybe the crowd would spare you. Maybe the emperor would be feeling generous. Or maybe you'd get the thumbs down because someone in the front row spilled their wine and needed a pick-me-up. And the sand, it remembered. It held the blood of thousands. It soaked up the last breaths of men who once dreamed of freedom, or at least a decent meal. It was raked between matches, sure, but no amount of smoothing could erase what had happened there. The sand was the real veteran. It had seen everything, and it never forgot. This is why it sucked to be a Roman gladiator. Because behind every cheer was a man hoping today wasn't the day he became part of the floor. The crowd didn't see fear. They saw performance. They didn't hear the wheezing breath behind the helmet, or the quiet prayer muttered. Before the gate opened, they saw a show. And the show had to go on. Even if it meant dragging a half-conscious man across the sand while the crowd booed, because he didn't die dramatically enough. But here's the thing, most of these men didn't sign up for this. They weren't thrill seekers or fame chasers. They weren't adrenaline junkies with a flair for the theatrical. Most gladiators weren't volunteers. They were prisoners of war, slaves or criminals. And Rome didn't ask for resumes. It just handed you a sword and said, "Try not to die too fast." You didn't get a welcome packet. You got shackles. You didn't get a training montage. You got a boot to the ribs, and a wooden sword heavier than your regrets. The moment you were captured, sentenced, or sold, your fate was sealed tighter than a senator's coin purse. You were property now, owned by a Lannister, the manager of a gladiator school, whose job was to turn you from terrified human into slightly less terrified human with a helmet. And the Lannister, he wasn't your coach. He was your investment manager. You were meat with potential. If you died too quickly, he lost money. If you survived long enough to get a fan following, he might sell you for a profit. Either way, your well-being was somewhere between feed the dogs and polish the statue of Jupiter on the priority list. The training schools, Ludi, were brutal. You were drilled, beaten, and taught to fight in specific styles, not for efficiency, but for entertainment value. You might be trained as a secutor, with a heavy helmet and short sword, or a thrakes, with a curved blade and a tiny shield that was more decorative than useful. Your fighting style wasn't about what worked best. It was about what looked coolest when you got stabbed. And you weren't alone. You were surrounded by others just like you. Men who had once been soldiers, farmers, rebels, or just unlucky enough to owe the wrong person money. You learned to fight beside them. You learned to eat beside them. And eventually, you learned to watch them die beside you. Because the arena didn't care about your backstory. It didn't care that you were once a proud warrior or a desperate thief. or a guy who just happened to be in the wrong village. When the Romans showed up, it cared about the show. About the clash of steel, the spray of blood, the roar of the crowd. Captured from distant lands Gauls, Thracians, Dacians, forced to fight for Roman amusement. Because nothing says civilization like importing people just to watch them die in style. Rome didn't just conquer territories, it collected people like souvenirs. After a successful campaign, the generals would parade their captives through the streets in triumph, then promptly sell them off to the highest bidder. Some went to mines, some to farms, and the unlucky ones, they were deemed entertaining, enough to be trained for the arena. Congratulations, you've just been promoted from enemy combatant to live action entertainment. The Gauls, with their wild hair and terrifying mustaches, were prized for their ferocity. The Thracians, agile and fierce, were often trained as Thrax fighters, wielding curved swords and tiny shields that screamed, "I'm stylish but doomed." The Dacians, they were known for their stubborn resistance and excellent cheekbones, perfect for dramatic deaths in front of a crowd. These weren't volunteers. They didn't sign up for this. They were dragged from their homes, shackled in chains, and marched across provinces to be sold like livestock. Rome didn't care if you were a warrior, a farmer, or just someone who happened to be standing too close to the wrong border. If you looked strong and screamed well, you were arena material, and once you were selected, the real fun began. You were stripped, inspected, and branded, literally, a hot iron to the flesh, marking you as property of the ludus. No name, no past, just a number and a scar. You were marched through the city, past jeering crowds and curious children, toward your new home. A stone-walled prison with a training yard and a very enthusiastic drill instructor. Shackled, branded, marched to the ludus, the gladiator school. Because nothing says, "Welcome to Rome," like a branding iron and a diet of barley gruel. The ludus wasn't a school in the way your local academy might be. There were no scrolls, no lectures, no toga-clad professors asking you to discuss your feelings. It was a prison with a training yard, a place where the walls were high. The food was bland, and the only diploma you earned came with a side of internal bleeding. You arrived in chains, were stripped of your name, and handed a wooden sword that weighed more than your will to live. The branding iron came first, a sizzling reminder that you were now property, hot metal pressed to skin, marking you like livestock. It didn't matter if you were once a noble, a soldier, or just a guy who owed the wrong senator a favor. The iron didn't discriminate. It just burned. Then came the diet. Barley gruel, beans, and the occasional fig, if someone in the kitchen was feeling generous. It was designed to bulk you up, not delight your palate. You weren't being fed, you were being fattened. Like a prize ox, except with more stabbing. Training was relentless. You rose with the sun and collapsed long after it set. You drilled with wooden weapons, twice the weight of real ones, so that when the real thing came, your arms wouldn't betray you, though your spine might. You sparred until your muscles screamed, then sparred some more. You learned to fight, to fall, to bleed with flair. You learned to entertain. Because in Rome, dying wasn't enough. You had to die well. There were no rest days, no holidays, no mental health breaks, just sweat, bruises, and the ever-present knowledge that your next match might be your last. You were watched constantly, by trainers, by guards, by the occasional noble who liked to scout talent, like he was picking out a new wine. And if you broke, if your body gave out or your spirit cracked, you weren't sent home. You were patched up, propped up, and shoved back into the ring. Because you weren't a person anymore. You were an investment, a spectacle, a tool. A man was no longer a man, just property, muscle to be broken and rebuilt. And Rome was very good at rebuilding. They didn't rebuild you with kindness. They rebuilt you with repetition, with drills, with bruises, with the kind of motivational speeches that involved a stick and a lot of yelling in Latin. You were reshaped into something useful, something profitable. Your past was irrelevant. Your future was a coin toss. What mattered was how well you could swing a sword without flinching, and how convincingly you could scream when stabbed. The Lannister didn't care about your dreams. He cared about your footwork. He cared about how fast you could block, how long you could last, and whether your death would get a standing ovation. You were trained like a racehorse, fed like a mule, and treated like a particularly violent stage prop. And if you showed promise, you got more training. If you didn't, you got more bruises. There was no room for weakness, no time for hesitation. You learned to fight not just for survival, but for applause. Because in Rome, applause was currency. It could buy you mercy. It could buy you fame. It could, on very rare occasions, buy you freedom. But first, you had to earn it. One swing, one dodge, one blood-slicked victory at a time. Gladiator school, the ludus. Wake at dawn. Train until dusk. Because in the empire of spectacle, sleep was for senators. The day began with the sound of shouting, usually in Latin, occasionally in pain. You rolled off your straw mat, stretched your bruises, and hoped your opponent for the day hadn't eaten better than you. There was no coffee, no warm-up, just a wooden sword in your hand and a trainer yelling that your footwork looked like a drunk goat's. The yard was a blur of sweat and shouting, men of every size and background, Gauls, Greeks, Numidians, Romans who'd made poor life choices, lined up in pairs, swinging, blocking, dodging. You trained until your arms went numb, and your legs forgot how to stand still. And then you trained some more. The doctors, your instructors, didn't care if you were tired. They cared if you could survive long enough to make the crowd cheer. They barked orders, corrected stances, and occasionally smacked you with a stick for motivation. You learned to fight in styles you'd never imagined. You learned to move like a murmillo, to strike like a secutor, to dodge like a Ricciarius with a net full of bad decisions. And the weapons. Oh, the weapons. You didn't just get a sword and a pat on the back. You got a curriculum. You drilled with everything: short swords, long swords, tridents, nets, daggers, shields the size of dinner plates and others the size of dinner tables. You learned to fight blindfolded, in pairs, against multiple opponents, and once, just for fun, against a wooden bull on wheels. Drill after drill, sword, net, trident, shield. Because in the ludus, repetition wasn't punishment. It was survival rehearsal. You didn't just train to fight. You trained to not die embarrassingly. Every move had to be second nature. Every block, every dodge, every dramatic pose had to be muscle memory. Because, when you stepped into the arena, there was no time to think. There was only time to react, and preferably not with your face. The Ricciarius learned to dance with a net and trident, light on his feet, dodging like a man who knew he had no armor and a very judgmental audience. The Murmillo, heavy and armored, trained to absorb blows and deliver crushing counterstrikes. The Secutor, sleek and helmeted, practiced charging like a human battering ram. Each style had its own rhythm, its own flair, its own way of making the crowd gasp or groan. And you didn't just train with weapons. You trained with weights, with wooden swords twice as heavy as the real thing, with sandbags, with drills that made your arms feel like overcooked noodles. You ran laps in full armor. You sparred until your bruises had bruises. You learned to fall without breaking your neck, and to rise without showing fear. Because fear was weakness, and weakness got punished. Punishments for laziness: whippings, shackled nights, starvation. Because in the ludus, taking it easy was a luxury reserved for corpses. You didn't get a warning. You got a welt. If your footwork was sloppy or your swing lacked enthusiasm, the trainers didn't pull you aside for a pep talk. They pulled out the whip. A few lashes across the back were considered motivational. Repeated offenses. You'd be shackled overnight in a cell, so cramped it made coffins look roomy. And if you really tested their patience, they just stop feeding you. Nothing says, shape up, like 3 days of barley, flavoured air. The Lannister didn't want excuses. You wanted results. You were an investment, not a person. If you broke, he'd patch you up. If you slacked, he'd punish you. If you died, he'd sigh and order another one. The Ludus wasn't a school, it was a factory. And the product was pain. Even the good days were bad. You might avoid the whip, but you couldn't avoid the food. Because in the Ludus, meals weren't about taste. They were about mass. You were being built into a fighting machine, not a food critic. Poor food. Barley porridge, beans, sometimes rancid meat. Because nothing fuels a blood sport quite like a bowl of disappointment. The Gladiator's diet was designed with all the culinary joy of a punishment. You weren't eating for pleasure. You were eating to become a walking slab of muscle that could bleed theatrically. The staple, barley porridge, thick, bland, and about as exciting as a wet sandal. It was affectionately known as Gladiator gruel, though no one was affectionate about it. It stuck to your ribs, your teeth, and your will to live. Barley was cheap filling and, according to Roman physicians, excellent for building bulk. Not strength, mind you, just mass. You were being fattened like a prize hog, not sculpted like a statue. The idea was to give you a layer of padding, so that when you got stabbed, it looked dramatic, but didn't kill you immediately. Because what's the point of a good stabbing if the crowd doesn't get at least 5 more minutes of entertainment? Beans were the second act in this tragic meal plan. High in protein, low in joy. They were boiled, mashed, or occasionally just stared at until they surrendered. They caused bloating, which was great for looking intimidating and less great for sharing a sleeping cell with 10 other men. Gladiators were known as Hordiri, barley men, which sounds noble until you realize it basically means guys who eat like livestock. And then there was the meat. When you got it, which wasn't often. And when you did, it was usually the kind of meat that made you question your life choices. Tough, stringy, and occasionally suspicious. If it smelled funny, you ate it faster, less time to think. If it moved, you hit it with a spoon and hoped it was just a particularly aggressive sausage. There were no feasts, no wine, no grapes being fed to you by adoring fans. Just bowls of beige, plates of sadness, and the occasional fig if someone in the kitchen had a guilty conscience. You didn't eat to enjoy. You ate to survive. And sometimes, even that was a gamble. Because if you slacked in training, if you mouthed off to the Lannister, or if you just looked a little too smug after winning a match, your next meal might be nothing. Or worse, double beans. Food was a tool, a reward, a punishment, a reminder that you were not in charge of your own stomach, let alone your fate. And who enforced this delightful dining experience? Who made sure you ate your porridge, swung your sword, and didn't die too early? Trainers, doctors, ex-gladiators themselves, cruel and strict. Because who better to teach you how to suffer than someone who already has the T-shirt and the scars? These weren't kindly mentors with encouraging slogans and ergonomic clipboards. These were men who had survived the arena, retired with their limbs mostly intact, and now spent their golden years yelling at terrified recruits. They didn't teach from scrolls, they taught from memory. Painful, vivid, bone-snapping memory. Each doctor specialized in a particular fighting style. If you were training as a Murmillo, Your trainer had once worn the same heavy helmet and lugged the same oversized shield. If you were a Ricciarius, your trainer had danced through sand with a net and trident, dodging swords and insults in equal measure. These men knew every trick, every feint, every way to make a crowd cheer, or at least not boo too loudly. And they were not gentle. They barked orders like centurions with a grudge. They corrected your stance with a stick, your timing with a slap, and your attitude with a week of extra drills. If you hesitated, they noticed. If you flinched, they punished. If you cried, they laughed, and then punished you for that too. Their job wasn't to make you feel good. Their job was to make sure you didn't die in the first 30 seconds of your debut. They taught you how to fight. Yes, but also how to perform. How to bleed with flair. How to fall like a tragic hero. How to die without begging. Because nothing ruined a good show like a gladiator sobbing into the sand. You learned how to read an opponent's eyes. How to use the sun to blind him. How to make your death look noble, even if your intestines were trying to escape. And they didn't just train your body. They trained your mind. They broke you down and rebuilt you into something leaner, meaner, and significantly more theatrical. You weren't allowed to fear death. You were expected to entertain it. The doctors were respected, feared, and occasionally hated, but no one questioned their authority. They had earned it, in blood, in scars, in the long list of names they could still remember from the days when they were the ones in the sand. And when training ended for the day, when the sun dipped low, and the yard fell silent, you didn't go home. You didn't get a warm bath and a soft bed. The brutal brotherhood. Gladiators slept in communal barracks, chained at night. Because nothing says team bonding like snoring, shackles, and the faint smell of despair. The barracks were not cozy. They were not rustic. They were not charmingly minimalist. They were stone boxes with straw on the floor, iron rings in the walls, and the kind of ventilation that made you nostalgic for swamp air. You didn't get a bed. You got a spot. If you were lucky, it wasn't next to the guy with night terrors, or the one who snored like a dying minotaur. At night, the chains came out, not metaphorical ones, actual iron shackles, clamped around your ankle and bolted to the wall like you were a particularly dangerous houseplant. It wasn't about security, it was about control. You weren't going anywhere, and Rome wanted you to remember that even in your dreams. Please. You changed, scratched, and occasionally cried in full view of 30 other men who were also trying to pretend they didn't just cry. The air was thick with sweat, fear, and the unmistakable aroma of we all had beans for dinner. Conversations were whispered, jokes were dark, and friendships were forged in the kind of environment that makes prison look like a wellness retreat. And yet, somehow, there was camaraderie. You shared food stories, and the occasional nice com. You learned who had your back in a sparring match, and who would absolutely trip you to avoid a punishment. You learned who used to be a farmer, who used to be a thief, and who used to be a prince before Rome decided he'd look better in a helmet and a loincloth. You laughed when you could. You fought when you had to. You survived together, even if you knew that survival was temporary. Because no matter how many jokes you cracked, or how many scars you compared, there was always one truth hanging in the air, like the smell of unwashed armor. You trained beside the man you'd someday kill, or die beside. And in the ludus, that was the closest thing to friendship you were allowed. There were no trust falls, no team-building retreats. Just 24 half-starved men swinging swords at each other while trying not to lose an eye. You learned to read people fast, who was quick, who was cruel, who was likely to snap and try to strangle someone with a sandal strap. You learned who snored, who lied, and who cried in their sleep. And you learn to keep your mouth shut about all of it. Because today's sparring partner might be tomorrow's opponent. And tomorrow's opponent might be the guy who once shared his last fig with you. Didn't matter. The crowd didn't care about your feelings. They cared about blood. Preferably yours, but they weren't picky. Still, bonds formed. Quiet ones. You'd help each other tighten armor straps. You'd share tips. Don't lead with your left. He always goes for the ribs. You'd laugh when someone tripped over their own net, and you'd look away when someone got punished for it. You weren't friends. You were co-survivors. And in the ludus, that was as close as it got. There were moments, brief, fragile ones, when the walls dropped. A joke muttered in the dark. A story about a home you barely remembered. A whispered plan to earn your freedom, even if you both knew it was a fantasy. You didn't say goodbye when someone didn't come back from a match. You just stared at the empty spot on the floor and hoped it wouldn't be yours next. And when the time came, when the gates opened, and the sun hit your face, and the roar of the crowd hit your chest, you stepped out beside the man you'd trained with, bled with, maybe even laughed with, and you raised your weapon, knowing that only one of you might walk back through that gate. Because in the arena, there were no friendships, only performances, and the audience didn't clap for mercy. Wounds were common. Infected cuts, broken noses, missing fingers. Because in the ludus, pain wasn't a side effect. It was part of the curriculum. You didn't leave training without a souvenir. A split lip, a black eye, a rib that clicked when you sneezed. These were the badges of progress. If you made it through a week without bleeding, congratulations. You were either incredibly skilled or incredibly good at hiding behind the guy who wasn't. The cuts came first. Tiny ones at first, nicks from a wooden sword, scrapes from falling on gravel. The occasional whoops from a sparring partner who forgot the difference between practice and performance. Then came the deeper ones, the kind that blurred through your tunic and made you hiss like a boiling kettle. You'd wrap it in whatever cloth you had, mutter something about just a scratch, and keep swinging. Because if you stopped, the doctor would give you something worse than a cut to lecture. Broken noses were practically a rite of passage. You weren't a real gladiator until your nose had been relocated at least once. Some guys had noses that pointed in 3 directions. Others had no bridge left at all. Just a vague suggestion of where a nose used to be. You learned to breathe through your mouth and accept that sneezing would now be a full-body event. And fingers, optional. You'd be amazed how many things you can still hold with only 7 of them. The ludus didn't offer dental plans or finger insurance. If you lost one, you were expected to adapt. Use the other hand, they'd say. Or your teeth. Or your willpower. One guy tied a dagger to his stump and called it innovation. The crowd loved him, until he tripped and stabbed himself in the thigh. Still, points for creativity. Infections were the real enemy. Not the sword. Not the trident. Not even the guy who kept, accidentally, elbowing you in the throat. No, it was the tiny cut that festered. The blister that turned green. The scrape that started to smell like regret. You'd wake up with a fever, a swollen limb, and the creeping suspicion that your body was staging a rebellion. And what did you get for medical care? No real doctor. Only a rudimentary medicus with vinegar and cloth. Because nothing says advanced healthcare like being dabbed with salad dressing by a guy who once treated a goat. The medicus wasn't exactly Rome's answer to modern medicine. He was more like a well, meaning butcher with a basic understanding of anatomy and a deep, possibly unhealthy, faith in vinegar. Got a gash. Vinegar. Fever. Vinegar. Missing a toe. Vinegar and a pep talk. If you were lucky. He'd throw in a strip of linen and a grunt of encouragement. He wasn't trained in a university. He was trained in the school of I've seen worse. His toolkit included a rusty scalpel, a sponge that had seen things, and a jar of something that might have once been honey, but now had opinions. Anesthesia. That was called biting down on a stick and screaming into your elbow. Sterilization. If the cloth didn't smell like last week's patient, it was considered clean. Broken bones were set with splints made from whatever wood was lying around. Infection was treated with hope and a prayer to Asclepius, the god of medicine, who was probably too busy dealing with senators complaining about gout. If your wound turned green, the medicus would nod solemnly and say something reassuring like, "That's normal," or "You probably won't lose the whole leg." And if you needed surgery, well, congratulations. You were about to become a very exciting story for the next batch of recruits. The medicus would roll up his sleeves, pour vinegar on everything, including your face, and get to work with the confidence of a man who once removed a splinter and now thinks he's a genius. There were no scalpels with precision, just knives, clamps, and the occasional hot iron for cauterizing, which doubled as a room heater in winter. Recovery was a gamble. If you didn't die from the wound, you might die from the treatment. If you didn't die from the treatment, you might wish you had. And if you somehow survived all of it, you got to go back to training with a limp and a new nickname like Wobbly Maximus. The medicus wasn't cruel. He was just outmatched. He did what he could with what he had, which was mostly vinegar, cloth, and a deeply concerning level of optimism. He patched you up, sent you back out, and hoped the next guy bled slower. Many died before they ever saw an arena. Because in the ludus, the real fight started long before the crowd ever cheered. You didn't need a lion to kill you. The training yard could do that just fine. The ludus was a meat grinder with a dress code, sandals optional, bruises mandatory. Every day was a gauntlet of exhaustion, infection, and the kind of injuries that made you nostalgic for paper cuts. You could die from a bad fall, a snapped tendon, or a sparring partner who forgot the word practice. And if the training didn't get you, the food might, or the water, or the medicus with his vinegar, soaked optimism. Some never made it past the first week. They collapsed mid-drill, heat stroke turning their vision into a watercolor of pain. Others got infections that spread faster than gossip in the barracks. A cut on Monday became a fever by Wednesday and a funeral by Friday, though funeral might be generous, more like quiet removal and a new name on the bunk. And then there were the ones who broke, not their bones, their minds. The ones who stared too long at the arena gate and realized it was a one-way trip. The ones who stopped eating, stopped talking, stopped hoping. They didn't scream. They just faded. The doctors called them weak. The others called them smart. The ludus didn't care. It kept grinding. New recruits arrived. Old ones vanished. The straw mats were reused. The armor was passed down. The cycle continued, because the arena needed bodies, and the ludus was the factory. But not everyone was dragged in chains. The cost of survival. Some volunteered Sea Octa 80, free men in debt, gambling their lives for coin. Because when your options are poverty or popularity via stabbing, some people pick the one with better lighting. Yes, believe it or not, some people chose to become gladiators. Not because they had a death wish, though that was a handy bonus, but because they were broke. Deeply, impressively. I sold my sandals for soup, broke. These were the Octorati, free men who signed a contract to become gladiators in exchange for a signing bonus, food, and the thrilling opportunity to be stabbed in front of 50,000 strangers. It was the Roman version of get rich or die trying, except with more loincloths and fewer retirement plans. The Octorati weren't dragged in chains. They walked in, signed the paperwork, and handed over their dignity like it was a coat at a party. In return, they got a roof over their heads, 3 meals a day, 2 of which were probably barley, and a shot at fame. Sure, the fame came with concussions and the occasional lion. But hey, beats starving in the gutter, while your creditors repossess your toga. Some were former soldiers who missed the thrill of battle. Others were gamblers who bet everything on a chariot race and lost to a horse named Flatulence. A few were just adrenaline junkies who thought, you know what's missing from my life? Public disembowelment. And Rome welcomed them with open arms and a branding iron. Because even if you volunteered, you still had to be marked like a prize cow. You were now property. Fancy, willing property, but property nonetheless. The Octorati got the same training, the same food, the same charming bunkmates with questionable hygiene. But they also got a weird kind of respect. After all, they chose this. They weren't conquered. They weren't sentenced. They looked at the world and said, I'd rather take my chances with a trident than with debt collectors. And sometimes it worked. A few became stars. They got nicknames, fans, even endorsements. This blood-stained tunic brought to you by Olive Ilus Maximus. They were the ancient equivalent of influencers, except instead of unboxing videos, they unboxed each other's rib cages. But most just fought and hoped and bled and wondered if maybe they should have just taken that job at the fish market. To fight meant a chance at fame and maybe freedom. Because in Rome, even hope came with a helmet. It was the dangling carrot in front of every bloodied nose. The ruders, a simple wooden sword that meant you were free. Not just free from the arena, but free from the shackles, the barracks, the barley porridge, and the nightly chorus of snoring and existential dread. It was the Roman version of a gold watch and a handshake, except you had to earn it by not dying, repeatedly. The promise of freedom was real, technically. If you survived enough fights, impressed the right people, and didn't get eaten by a leopard with performance anxiety, you might be granted your release. The crowd could chant for it. The editor of the games could nod solemnly. And if the stars aligned, and the emperor wasn't in a bad mood, you'd be handed the rudis and told, congratulations, you're no longer property. You're just a guy with a lot of scars and no marketable skills. Some gladiators fought for years chasing that dream. They counted their victories like coins, each one a step closer to the exit. They learned to play the crowd, to bleed just enough, to fall dramatically and rise heroically. They became legends, not just for their skill, but for their survival. Because in a profession with a retirement plan that mostly involved tombstones, surviving was the ultimate flex. And when that moment came, when the rudis was placed in their hand and the crowd roared, they were free. Free to leave. Free to live. Free to figure out what came next. Which, as it turned out, was complicated. Because freedom wasn't a clean slate. It was a stained one. You didn't walk out of the arena into a villa and a vineyard. You walked out with a reputation. You were famous, yes, but famous for killing, for bleeding, for being entertainment. You were a walking paradox, admired and avoided. People cheered your name in the arena and crossed the street to avoid you in the market. Some gladiators became trainers, returning to the ludus to teach the next generation how to survive. Others became bodyguards, using their skills to protect senators who once bet on their deaths. A few tried to disappear, to live quiet lives as farmers or merchants. But the scars didn't fade, the limp didn't vanish, and the nightmares didn't stop just because the crowd did. And then there were the ones who came back, not because they had to, but because they didn't know how to be anything else. The arena was brutal, but it was simple. Clear rules, clear goals, clear enemies. The outside world, that was messy. Confusing. Full of people who smiled to your face and whispered behind your back. In the arena, at least you knew who wanted to kill you. So some returned. Voluntarily. They picked up the sword again, not for freedom, but for familiarity, for the roar of the crowd, for the only place they ever felt seen. But freedom rarely came. Even if you survived, scars and infamy followed you home. Because in Rome, the fight didn't end when the match did. It just changed arenas. Let's say you beat the odds. You survived the ludus, the infections, the lions, the guy with the trident, who clearly had unresolved anger issues. You earned your rudis, your wooden sword of freedom. The crowd cheered. The editor smiled. You walked out of the arena alive, free, and with all your limbs mostly where they started. Great, right? Well, sort of. Because now you were a free man with a gladiator's past, and that came with baggage. You weren't just any citizen. You were that citizen. The one who used to be property. The one who used to bleed for applause. The one who once got stabbed in the thigh, and still finished the fight with a sword in one hand and his dignity in the other, barely. People recognized you. Some admired you. Some feared you. Most weren't sure whether to ask for your autograph or cross the street. You were famous, but not respectable. You were a walking contradiction, a symbol of Roman courage, and a reminder of Roman cruelty. You were the guy who made senators cheer and philosophers cringe. You couldn't run for office. You couldn't marry into a decent family. You couldn't even sit in the good seats at the theatre. You were infames, a legal status that basically meant, congratulations, you're free, but don't get any ideas. You had no political rights, no social standing, and no real path to redemption. You were a living legend with nowhere to go. Some tried to reinvent themselves. They opened taverns, trained new gladiators, or became bodyguards for the same elites who once bet on their deaths. Others tried to disappear, to live quietly in the countryside, hoping no one would recognize the limp, or the scar, or the haunted look in their eyes. But Rome had a long memory, and scars have a way of speaking louder than words. And then there were the ones who couldn't let go, who missed the roar of the crowd, the rush of combat, the strange comfort of knowing exactly who wanted to kill you and why. They returned to the arena, not as slaves, but as opterati, volunteers. Because sometimes the only thing harder than surviving the arena was surviving without it. Gladiators were half celebrity, half scum, worshipped in the arena, whispered about in the streets, and never truly free. They were the rock stars of ancient Rome, if rock stars were owned, underfed, and occasionally mauled by leopards. The crowd adored them. Children mimicked their moves in alleyways. Merchants sold tiny figurines of their likenesses. Poets wrote odes to their bravery and their biceps. Women swooned. Men cheered. And senators pretended not to be fans while placing hefty bets behind closed doors. But outside the arena, it was complicated. You might be recognized in the market, but that didn't mean you were welcome. You might be invited to a banquet, but only as entertainment. You were famous, yes, but not respectable. You were a walking contradiction, a symbol of Roman valor, and a reminder of Roman brutality. People loved you in the same way they loved a thunderstorm, loud, dangerous, and best admired from a safe distance. Some gladiators leaned into the fame. They wore flashy tunics, strutted through the streets like peacocks with PTSD, and signed autographs on amphorae. Others kept their heads down, knowing that fame was fickle, and the next match could turn cheers into silence. And then there were those who tried to escape it altogether, who left the city, changed their names, and prayed no one recognized the limp, or the scar shaped like a trident. The state loved gladiators too, just not enough to treat them like people. They were tools of propaganda, symbols of Roman dominance, living proof that the empire could take anyone, barbarian, criminal, debtor, and turn them into a spectacle. They were used to distract the masses, to curry favor with the crowd, to remind everyone that Rome was powerful and you were not. And yet, despite it all, they endured. They trained. They fought. They bled. And they became legends. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Fighters were classified by type. Mamillo with sword and shield. Ricciarius with net and trident. Thrakes with curved blade. Because even in death matches, Rome loved a good filing system. The Romans didn't just throw people into the arena and hope for the best. They curated their carnage. Gladiators were sorted into categories, like a particularly violent library. Each type had its own weapons, armor, fighting style, and fan base. Yes, fan base! Because nothing says civilized society like arguing over whether the guy with the fish helmet could beat the guy with the salad fork. The Mamillo was the tank of the arena. He carried a massive rectangular shield, scutum, and a short sword, gladius, the same kind Roman soldiers used to conquer half the known world. His helmet was a bronze bucket with a fish-shaped crest, because apparently nothing says intimidating like aquatic headwear. He was heavily armored, slow, moving, and built like a brick bathhouse. His job: absorb hits, wear down his opponent, and occasionally kick someone in the shin with a metal grave. Then, there was the Ricciarius, the wild card. Lightly armored, fast, and armed with a net and trident, he looked less like a warrior and more like someone who got lost on the way to a seafood restaurant. But don't laugh. He was dangerous. The net could entangle, the trident could skewer, and the dagger at his waist was for when things got personal. He fought without a helmet, relying on speed, agility, and the hope that his opponent had skipped leg day. And let's not forget the Thrakes, or Thracian. He wielded a curved sword, seeker, designed to get around shields and into places you'd rather not be stabbed. His helmet had a high crest and a visor that made him look like a very angry rooster. He carried a small, square shield and wore greaves on both legs, because he knew he'd be doing a lot of dodging. The Thrakes was flashy, fast, and favoured by fans who liked their violence with a bit of flair. These weren't just costumes. They were roles in a deadly drama. The matchups were carefully chosen for contrast and spectacle. Heavy vs light, speed vs strength, fish guy vs net guy. It was all part of the show. And the crowd had favourites. Some cheered for the brute force of the Mamillo. Others loved the underdog agility of the Ricciarius. And some just wanted to see someone trip over their own net. Each style meant brutal training and different odds of survival. Because in Rome, even your fighting technique came with a built-in expiration date. You didn't just get handed a sword and told, "Good luck." You were molded into a specific type of gladiator, like a very sweaty action figure with limited accessories. And each type came with its own perks, drawbacks, and likelihood of being turned into arena mulch. The Mamillo, for example, was built like a walking fortress. His armor was heavy, his shield massive, and his helmet so enclosed it doubled as a personal sauna. He was trained to absorb punishment and deliver slow, crushing blows. Great for defense. Terrible for cardio. If you were a Mamillo, your odds of survival were decent, unless you tripped, overheated, or got matched against someone who could run circles around you. The Ricciarius, on the other hand, was the gladiator equivalent of I brought a net to a sword fight. Lightly armored as red, basically naked. He relied on speed, agility, and the hope that his opponent had poor depth perception. His net could entangle, his trident could skewer, and his dagger was for when things got up close and personal. He was flashy, unpredictable, and often underestimated, until he wasn't. But if he missed with that net, well, let's just say the crowd loved a good underdog story, especially when it ended in tragedy. Then there was the Thrakes, the Thracian fighter, who wielded a curved sword and a tiny shield that looked like it came from the toddler section of the armory. He was fast, aggressive, and trained to exploit openings with surgical precision. His style was all about angles, cutting around shields, ducking under swings, and generally being a nightmare to fight. But his armor left plenty of gaps, and one wrong move could turn him into a cautionary tale. And let's not forget the Secutor, designed specifically to fight the Ricciarius. His helmet had tiny eye holes to protect against the trident, which also meant he had the peripheral vision of a sleepy mole. He was built for charging, cornering, and hoping he didn't run into a wall. His matches were like a deadly game of tag, with the added bonus of sand in every crevice. Each style had its fans. Each style had its risks. And each style came with a shelf life. You could be the best Thrakes in the Empire, but one bad matchup, one twisted ankle, one distracted Emperor, and you were done. The arena didn't care about your stats. It cared about the show. Armor was heavy, sand hot and blinding. Because nothing says glory like heat stroke in a metal bucket. Imagine stepping into the arena at high noon. The sun glaring down like an angry god with a magnifying glass. Your helmet, a bronze oven. Your breastplate, a portable sauna. Your graves, fancy leg roasters. Every inch of your body is wrapped in metal, leather, or regret. You're sweating before you even draw your weapon. And by the time the trumpet sounds, you've already lost 3 pounds and most of your will to live. The sand beneath your feet isn't just hot. It's vindictive. It reflects the sun, blinds your eyes, and somehow finds its way into every fold, crease, and orifice. It clings to your wounds, your armor, your dignity. You try to focus on your opponent, but your vision is a shimmering mirage of heat waves and poor life choices. You blink, and suddenly you're not sure if that's a man charging at you, or just a very aggressive hallucination. And the armor. Oh, the armor. It's not tailored for comfort. It's tailored for spectacle. It clanks, it pinches, it shifts at the worst possible moment. Your helmet restricts your vision to a narrow slit, so you're basically fighting through a glorified mailbox. Your shield is heavy enough to block a chariot, but also heavy enough to dislocate your shoulder if you sneeze too hard. And don't even get started on the chafing. Let's just say there's a reason gladiators didn't wear white. You're expected to move with grace, strike with precision, and look heroic, while slowly cooking inside your own armor. The crowd doesn't care that your calves are cramping, or that your helmet smells like last week's loser. They want drama. They want blood. They want to see you stumble, falter, fall, because in the arena, there are no second chances. One slip, one mistake, your throat cut open for thousands to cheer, and somewhere in the stands, a vendor yells, "Fresh figs! Get your fresh figs!" Because the show must go on. There was no pause for tragedy. No moment of silence. No respectful hush as a man blod out in the sand. The arena was not a place for mourning. It was a place for momentum. The crowd came for action, not introspection. So when a gladiator fell, whether from a clean strike, a lucky jab, or sheer exhaustion, the show didn't stop. It pivoted. Vendors kept hawking their wares like nothing had happened. "Figs! Olives! Honeyed nuts!" echoed over the dying gasps of a man who, moments ago, had been the star of the show. Somewhere, a child asked if they could have a souvenir. Somewhere else, a noblewoman dabbed her eyes. Not from sorrow, but because the dust was ruining her eyeliner. The arena was a machine, and blood was just part of the oil that kept it running. The sand was raked, the body dragged, and the next act prepared. Maybe it was a beast fight. Maybe a mock naval battle. Maybe just 2 more poor souls, shoved into the spotlight with nothing but a helmet and a prayer. Either way, the crowd barely blinked, and the absurdity of it all. That vendor yelling about figs might have been standing 10 feet from a corpse. But business was business. You couldn't let a little thing like a severed artery ruin your sales pitch.
Fresh figs! Still warm!
He might have added. Unintentionally accurate. The arena was a paradox, a place of death that pulsed with life. A place where men died to thunderous applause. And someone in the back row complained that their wine was too warm. It was theatre, sport, execution, and picnic, all rolled into one. The crowd, senators, beggars, emperors, everyone watched. Because in Rome, blood was the great equalizer, and everyone had a front row seat. The Colosseum was the only place in the empire where a senator and a shoemaker could sit side by side and both scream, "Finish him!" with equal enthusiasm. It was the great Roman unifier, an amphitheatre of shared gasps, spilled wine, and collective bloodlust. Status didn't matter once the games began. Whether you wore a toga with a purple stripe, or a tunic with yesterday's stew on it, you were there for the same reason, to watch someone else risk their life for your entertainment. The emperor had his own box. Of course, shaded, elevated, and flanked by guards who looked like they hadn't blinked since breakfast. But even he wasn't immune to the thrill. A well-timed kill could boost his popularity. A boring match, that could spark grumbling in the streets. Bread and circuses weren't just a distraction. They were a political strategy. Keep the people fed, keep them entertained, and maybe they wouldn't notice the taxes, or the occasional assassination. The senators came in robes and left with betting slips. The merchants came to network and stayed to cheer. The beggars came for the free bread and stayed for the drama. Even the Vestal virgins had reserved seats, because nothing says sacred chastity like front row tickets to a decapitation. And the crowd wasn't quiet. They roared. They jeered. They chanted names like rock stars at a concert. They threw cushions, coins, and occasionally insults. They demanded blood, spectacle, and the kind of drama that made your average soap opera look like a polite tea party. Gladiators lived and died by that roar. It could save you. It could doom you. It could turn you into a legend or a footnote. Because in Rome, the arena wasn't just a place. It was the place where reputations were made, where grudges were settled, where the empire flexed its muscles and its morals, usually in opposite directions. Fights began with music, parades, ceremonial weapons blessed by priests, because nothing says sacred ritual like a trumpet fanfare before someone gets impaled. The games didn't just start, they arrived. With flair, with noise, with enough pomp to make a wedding look like a casual brunch. The opening ceremonies of a gladiatorial spectacle were a full-blown theatrical production, complete with musicians, dancers, incense, and enough pageantry to make Jupiter himself raise an eyebrow. First came the musicians, horns, flutes, drums, blaring out a fanfare that could wake the deads, and probably did, if you counted the condemned men, pacing nervously in the holding cells. The sound echoed through the stone arches of the amphitheatre, bouncing off marble and muscle alike. It wasn't just music, it was a warning, a signal that the day's entertainment was about to begin, and that someone's spleen was probably going to end up on display. Then came the pompa, the grand parade. Gladiators marched in formation, weapons gleaming, armor polished to a blinding shine. They weren't just fighters, they were performers, and this was their red carpet moment. Behind them came the beast handlers, leading lions, leopards, and the occasional very confused ostrich. Priests followed, swinging censers of incense and muttering blessings that probably sounded more comforting if you didn't speak Latin. And the weapons. Oh, they were blessed. Not just sharpened and polished, but ritually sanctified by priests who waved incense and chanted over them like they were preparing for a wedding, instead of a bloodbath. The idea was to make the violence feel official, like the gods had RSVP'd and were watching from the best seats in the house. Because if you're going to stab someone in front of 50,000 people, it helps to know the divine are cool with it. The editor of the games, the sponsor, often a politician looking to boost his popularity, would give a speech, usually something along the lines of, "Let the games begin," but with more Latin and fewer vowels. Then the gates would open, the crowd would roar, and the first match would begin. But not all matches were created equal. Some duels to first blood, others to the death, because in Rome, the difference between a scratch and a funeral was often just crowd enthusiasm and a thumbs up or down. Not every match was a death sentence, at least, not officially. Some bouts were declared ad ludum, to the game, meaning the goal was to fight, until one man was wounded, disarmed, or just too exhausted to continue. These were the friendly matches, if you can call two men trying to concuss each other with iron weapons friendly. The idea was to showcase skill, not slaughter. A little blood, a dramatic fall, maybe a dislocated shoulder. Just enough to get the crowd clapping and the editor nodding in approval. But then there were the sign mission fights, no mercy, no reprieve, no survivors. These were the main events. The ones that packed the stands and made the vendors run out of figs. In these matches, the only way out was victory or death. And sometimes, even victory wasn't enough. If the crowd didn't like your performance, if you fought too cautiously, bled too little, or failed to deliver a satisfying death blow, they could turn on you faster than a starving lion. The final decision often rested with the editor of the games, usually a magistrate or emperor. But let's be honest, he was just reading the room. If the crowd roared for mercy, you might live to fight another day. If they roared for blood, well, better hope your opponent was feeling generous or clumsy. And then there was the infamous gesture, the pollice verso, the turned thumb. Contrary to popular belief, historians still debate exactly what it looked like. Was it thumbs up for death? Thumbs down? Sideways? Jad's hands. No one's entirely sure. But the meaning was clear. The crowd had spoken. And your fate was sealed by a flick of the wrist and a collective craving for carnage. It was theatre, politics, and bloodsport rolled into one. A gladiator could win the match and still lose his life, or lose the match and win the crowd. And with it, a second chance. Because in Rome, survival wasn't just about skill. It was about spectacle. Gladiators sometimes fought animals, lions, bears, leopards starved to make them savage. Because when swords weren't enough, Rome added claws. These weren't your average zoo day encounters. These were venations, beast hunts, where the beasts were angry, hungry, and very much not in the mood for cuddles. The Romans, ever the connoisseurs of chaos, decided that watching two men try to kill each other wasn't quite spicy enough. So they threw in animals. Big ones, with teeth. Enter the bestiari, gladiators trained specifically to fight wild animals. Think of them as the ancient world's worst zookeepers. They faced lions with manes like thunderclouds, bears the size of chariots, and leopards so fast they made your last thought a blur. Sometimes they were armed, sometimes they were not. Sometimes they were just there to run in circles, while the crowd placed bets on how long they'd last. The animals weren't just wild, they were prepared, starved for days, agitated, and sometimes even drugged to make them more aggressive. They were released into the arena through hidden trapdoors, emerging from the sand like furry nightmares. The crowd roared, the trumpet blared, and the poor soul in the center realized he was now the world's least enthusiastic lion tamer. And it wasn't just about survival. It was about style. You couldn't just kill the beast. You had to do it with flair. A clean strike, a dramatic dodge, a final pose as the creature collapsed in a heap of fur and fury. The crowd wanted a show. And if the animal won, even better. Nothing got the audience on their feet like a gladiator being flung across the arena, by a bear with boundary issues. Sometimes, the animals weren't even the main event. They were the warm-up act. A little blood to whet the appetite before the real carnage began. Other times, they were used for executions. Condemned criminals thrown to the beasts as a lesson in what happens when you steal a senator's sandals. But whether you were a trained bestiarius or just unlucky, one truth remained: the animals didn't care about your backstory. They didn't care if you were a hero, a villain, or just really good with a trident. They cared that you were made of meat. If a man fell, he looked to the crowd. Thumbs up or down decided his fate. Because in Rome, mercy was a performance, and the audience held the script. The arena was not a battlefield, it was a stage. And every fallen gladiator knew his role in the final act. You didn't just collapse and hope for the best. You performed your defeat. You dropped to one knee, raised your hand, and locked eyes with the crowd like a contestant on the deadliest game show in history. The sword might have missed your heart, but your fate now rested in the hands of 50,000 amateur critics with strong opinions and weak moral compasses. The crowd's reaction was everything. If they liked you, if you'd fought bravely, bled beautifully, and maybe winked at a Vestal Virgin, you had a chance. They might chant for mercy, wave their handkerchiefs, or shout your name like you were the lead singer of a very violent boy band. But if you disappointed them, if you'd stumbled, hesitated, or looked like you were trying not to cry, the thumbs came out. Now, here's where it gets messy. Contrary to what Hollywood taught us, the whole thumbs up means live, thumbs down means die thing. Not exactly accurate. In ancient Rome, the gestures were more cryptic. A thumbs up, pollis verso, might actually have meant kill him, as in, unsheathe the sword. A thumbs down could mean, sheathe it, or let him live. Or maybe it was the other way around. Scholars still argue about it like it's the world's bloodiest game of charades. Sometimes the crowd didn't even use thumbs. They might shout, wave, or just make vague stabbing motions. It was less jury of your peers, and more mob with opinions. And if the editor of the games, usually a magistrate or emperor, was feeling theatrical, he'd let the crowd decide, because nothing says justice like a popularity contest with a body count. But if the crowd was indecisive, or if the match was particularly high profile, the final call didn't come from the masses. If wounded but alive, you waited for the emperor's signal. Because in Rome, even death needed imperial approval. You could be on your knees, bleeding from 3 places, vision swimming, lungs wheezing like a broken bellows, and still, you didn't move. Not until the emperor moved first. He sat high above the arena, shaded by silk, flanked by guards, and dressed like a god who just raided a jewelry store. All eyes turned to him, yours included. He might raise a finger. He might tilt his head. He might sip his wine and pretend to think deeply while actually wondering if the grilled dormice were overcooked. But eventually he'd give the signal. A gesture, a nod, a flick of the wrist that decided whether you got a second chance or a second stab. And you waited. You waited with sand in your mouth and blood in your boots, praying that your performance had been dramatic enough, your death sufficiently poetic, your opponent sufficiently smug. Because the emperor wasn't just judging your skill, he was judging your entertainment value. You weren't a man. You were a plot twist. Sometimes he played to the crowd. Sometimes he defied them. Sometimes he just liked the way your opponent's helmet sparkled in the sun and decided, let's keep that one. It was arbitrary, theatrical, and terrifying. A man could survive 10 matches and die because the emperor had indigestion. And if the emperor gave the signal for mercy, you lived. You were dragged off, patched up, and maybe, just maybe, fought another day. But if he gave the signal for death, Your opponent stepped forward, raised his blade, and gave the crowd what they came for. Sometimes mercy was given, but more often, the crowd wanted blood, because in Rome, forgiveness was rare. But a good execution was timeless. Mercy was a luxury, not a guarantee. It was a dramatic flourish, a moment of suspense, a chance for the crowd to feel powerful. But let's be honest, most of them didn't come for mercy. They came for mayhem. They didn't want to see a man spared. They wanted to see him split. They wanted the sand to turn red and the victor to raise his blade like a bloody exclamation point. The crowd was fickle. One day they might chant for clemency, moved by a gladiator's bravery or a particularly stylish dodge. The next, they'd bay for blood because their wine was warm or their favorite charioteer lost a race that morning. Gladiators knew this. They didn't fight for mercy. They fought for momentum, for spectacle, for the kind of performance that made the crowd hesitate before demanding their head. And even when mercy was granted, it wasn't always permanent. You might be spared today and fed to a leopard next week. You might win the crowd's favor only to lose it in your next match. The arena didn't do loyalty. It did drama. And nothing was more dramatic than a man begging for his life, while 50,000 people debated whether he deserved it. The emperor could override the crowd, of course. But emperors were people too. People with egos, grudges, and a flair for the theatrical. Some were merciful, others were less so. Claudius, for instance, was known to order executions, just to see the look on a man's face as he died. Because nothing says, benevolent ruler, like a front row seat to a trident in the spleen. And if you weren't a trained gladiator, if you were just a criminal, a prisoner, or someone who annoyed the wrong senator. Executions happened in the arena too. Criminals mauled by beasts for warm-up acts. Because in Rome, even death had an opening number. Before the main event, before the gladiators clashed, and the crowd roared, and someone's spleen became a conversation piece, there was the halftime show. Except in Rome, halftime didn't mean marching bands and overpriced snacks. It meant damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. A spectacle so grim, so grotesque, it made the actual gladiator fights look like a spirited game of tag. These weren't trained fighters. They were criminals, prisoners of war, political dissidents, or just people who'd annoyed the wrong patrician. They were dragged into the arena unarmed, unarmored, and very, very aware of what was about to happen. Some were tied to stakes. Others were forced to perform in elaborate reenactments of myths, like poor Actaeon torn apart by his own hounds, or Orpheus serenading wild animals until one of them decided it hated music. And the animals, oh, they were ready. Lions, bears, leopards, wild boars, starved for days, agitated, and released through trapdoors with all the subtlety of a thunderclap. The crowd loved it. They laughed. They gasped. They placed bets on which criminal would be eaten first, which beast would get the juiciest bite, and whether the guy on the seesaw would launch his partner directly into a lion's mouth. Yes, that was a real thing. Sometimes the executions were theatrical. Sometimes they were just brutal. But always, they were public. A reminder of Rome's power. A warning to anyone thinking of stepping out of line. And a convenient way to keep the audience entertained, while the gladiators stretched and the vendors restocked their figs. And when it was over, when the last scream had faded and the last beast had been herded off stage, the arena had to be reset, because the show wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Gladiators cleaned the sand, covering blood with fresh layers for the next fight, because in Rome, even the floor got a costume change between acts. The arena floor wasn't just a stage, it was a sponge. A gritty, sun-baked, gore-soaked sponge. After every match, it bore the evidence of what had transpired: footprints, drag marks, splatters, puddles, and the occasional tooth, and while the crowd cheered, gossiped, or argued over whether the last guy's scream was dramatic enough, a small army of workers, often slaves or low-ranking gladiators, got to work with rakes, shovels, and fresh sand. Yes, sand. The Latin word arena literally means sand, and for good reason. It wasn't just there for aesthetics. It soaked up blood, masked the smell, and gave the next fighters a clean-ish canvas to paint their own tragedy. Think of it as the world's most macabre etch-a-sketch. Shake it, smooth it, and start again. The cleaning crew moved quickly. They had to. The games were tightly scheduled, and no one wanted to delay the next decapitation. They raked over the blood, and scooped out the chunks, and spread a fresh layer of sand like decorators, prepping for a very aggressive wedding. Sometimes they even added colored sand, red for drama, black for mourning, gold for special occasions. Because if you're going to host a public execution, you might as well coordinate your palate. And while the crowd sipped wine and munched olives, the workers toiled in the heat, erasing the evidence of the last man's failure. The arena had to look pristine, not out of respect, but because the spectacle demanded it. Blood was thrilling. Old blood was just bad taste. Once the sand was smoothed, the next act began. Trumpets blared, gates creaked open, and another pair of fighters stepped into the sun, unaware, or all too aware, of how many layers of death lay beneath their feet. If you survived, you limped back to the barracks. Because in Rome, the prize for not dying was a bruised body, a bowl of beans, and the promise of doing it all again tomorrow. There was no victory parade, no confetti, no post-match interview where you got to thank the gods and your trident. Just the slow, aching shuffle back through the gates of the ludus. Every step a reminder that your bones were still inside your body. Barely. You didn't walk so much as ooze back to your bunk, trailing sweat, blood, and the kind of fatigue that made your soul feel like it needed a nap. The barracks didn't welcome you. They tolerated you. You collapsed onto your straw mat, which smelled like a combination of mildew, despair, and someone else's last bad day. Around you, other survivors groaned, coughed, or stared blankly at the ceiling like philosophers, contemplating the meaning of pain. No one spoke. Not because they didn't want to, but because their jaws were too swollen. And then came the food. If you were lucky, someone had saved you a bowl of beans. If you were really lucky, they hadn't already been chewed. You ate slowly, not out of savoring, but because your hands were shaking and your lip was split. Every bite tasted like victory and regret. You didn't eat to recover. You ate to endure. Because tomorrow, the sun would rise, the trumpet would blare, and the doctor would yell like nothing had happened. There was no rest day, no spy treatment. No. You did great out there, champ. Just the knowledge that you'd survived one more round in a game, where the rules were written in blood, and the prize was another chance to play. And if you were injured, if your arm didn't bend right, or your ribs made a new sound when you breathed, no proper stitches, no painkillers, just wine and grit. Because in Rome, the only anesthesia was denial served in a clay cup. You didn't get a sterile operating room. You got a bench, a bucket, and a man with a beard who smelled like regret and oregano. The medicus wasn't there to comfort you. He was there to keep you from dying too quickly. His tools were basic: a dull knife, a bronze probe, and a jug of wine that doubled as disinfectant, painkiller, and emotional support beverage. If you had a gash, he'd pour wine on it, not because it helped much, but because it made you scream loud enough to distract from the stitching. Done. With a curved needle and thread that may or may not have been previously used on a tunic. No antiseptic, no numbing agent, just a firm grip and the soothing words, "Try not to move, or you'll lose the rest of your ear." Dislocations were fixed with brute force and a prayer. The medicus would yank, twist, and pop things back into place like he was assembling flat pack furniture without instructions. If you passed out, great. If you didn't, you got more wine. If you screamed, he told you to be grateful you still had lungs. And if you needed something removed, an arrowhead, a splinter, a piece of someone else's trident, you were held down by your bunkmates, while the medicus dug around like he was searching for treasure in a meat pie eater. There was no clean cut. There was just cut and hope. Recovery was a gamble. You might heal. You might get an infection. You might get gangrene and lose a limb. But you didn't complain. Complaining got you laughed at. Or worse, scheduled for another match to toughen you up. Because in the ludus, pain wasn't a problem. It was a process. And if you couldn't handle it, you didn't belong. Broken bones, infected cuts, missing limbs. Because in Rome, the body was disposable, but the show had to go on. You weren't a person. You were a prop. A moving, bleeding, occasionally screaming prop in the grand theatre of Roman entertainment. And like any good prop, if you broke, you were patched up just enough to be used again. Maybe not as the star of the show, but definitely as the guy who gets dramatically impaled in Act 2Y. A snapped femur, splintered with sticks and hope. A dislocated shoulder, yanked back into place by a guy who once fixed a chariot wheel and figured, how different can it be? Missing a finger, wrap it, cauterize it, and learn to grip your sword like a crab with commitment issues. Infections were everywhere. A cut wasn't just a cut, it was a countdown. You'd watch it swell, redden, ooze, and eventually smell like something that should be buried, not bandaged. But you didn't stop. You couldn't. Because if you weren't fighting, you weren't earning your keep. And if you weren't earning your keep, you were just another mouth to feed. And Rome didn't do charity. Some gladiators limped into the arena with more scars than skin. Others fought with one eye, one ear, or one good leg, and a whole lot of spite. There were men who'd lost so many fingers they held their weapons like toddlers, holding crayons. And yet, they fought. Because the alternative was worse obscurity, starvation, or being fed to something with more teeth than empathy. And the crowd, they didn't care. If anything, they loved it. A limping gladiator was a story. A man missing an arm but still swinging a sword with his teeth. That was drama. That was ratings. That was Rome. You weren't expected to be whole. You were expected to be useful. And if you could still stand, still swing, still scream convincingly when stabbed, then congratulations, you were still part of the show. Some begged to be freed, but were thrown back into the next match. Because in the empire of spectacle, mercy was a luxury, and gladiators were renewable resources. You could plead. You could cry. You could fall to your knees and swear, by every god in the Roman pantheon, that you'd earned your freedom. But unless you had the crowd's love, the editor's favor, and the luck of a man who'd never stepped on a rake, your words meant nothing. You were property. And property doesn't get to negotiate. Some gladiators tried to appeal to their Lannister. The trainer, the owner, the man who decided whether you got a day off or a new scar. But the Lannister had quotas to meet and patrons to please. If you could still stand, still swing, still scream convincingly when stabbed, then congratulations, you were still profitable. And in Rome, profit trumped pity every time. Others tried to fake injuries. A limp here, a cough there, a dramatic collapse during drills. But the doctor had seen it all. He'd poke, prod, and if necessary, throw you into a sparring match to test your recovery. Nothing cured a fake limp like a real spear. And if you really pushed it, if you refused to fight, refused to train, refused to play your part, you might find yourself in a different kind of match. One with no weapons, no armor. Just you, a hungry animal, and a crowd that had already decided you were the villain in today's story. Because the games weren't about justice. They were about rhythm, about keeping the blood flowing, the crowd roaring, the empire entertained. You weren't a man. You were a beat in the drumline of Roman spectacle. And if you missed your cue, they'd replace you with someone louder, bloodier, and less inclined to beg. But not everyone faded into the sand. A rare few became famous, their faces painted on tavern walls, loved by crowds. Because even in a world built on blood, some stars still managed to shine. They were the arena's darlings, the poster boys of pain. Their names were chanted in the streets, etched into wax tablets, and whispered in the dark corners of bathhouses. Children reenacted their victories with wooden spoons and laundry baskets. Merchants sold crude figurines of them, some accurate, some wildly optimistic. No, Gaius the Gaul did not have abs like that. And taverns were shrines. Their faces were painted on walls, scratched into tables, and toasted nightly with slurred oaths and spilled wine. These were the Divi Arenari, the gods of the sand. They had nicknames like the Red Storm, the Hammer of Herculaneum, or that guy who killed a bear with a spoon. They were mythologized while still breathing, their feats exaggerated with every retelling. One supposedly fought blindfolded. Another was said to have caught a trident mid-air and thrown it back. Whether true or not didn't matter. The crowd believed, and belief was currency. They got perks too. Better food, better armor, better sleeping arrangements, which, in gladiator terms, meant fewer rats and slightly less mildew. Some were even granted lovers. Noblewomen who fancied a bit of danger with their romance, or noblemen who appreciated a well-sculpted torso and a good death stare. Gladiators received fan mail, actual wax tablets with messages like, "You fight like Mars himself," or "Please don't die. I named my goat after you." And the fame wasn't just local. Word traveled. A star in Rome might be summoned to fight in Capua, Pompeii, or even Gaul. They were exported like fine wine and exotic spices, except with more bruises and fewer shipping guarantees. Some even had entourages, armor polishers, hype men, and that one guy who always carried a towel and looked important. But fame in the arena was a fickle flame. But fame faded quickly, because in Rome, yesterday's hero was tomorrow's footnote, and the sand never remembered your name for long. One day, you were the darling of the arena. The crowd chanted your name like a hymn. Tavern walls bore your likeness, some flattering, some wildly optimistic. You never had that many abs. Children mimicked your moves in alleyways. Senators toasted your victories with watered wine and whispered wagers. You were the storm in the amphitheater, the thunder in the blood-soaked sand. And then, nothing. Maybe you lost a match. Maybe you limped instead of lunged. Maybe a newer, younger gladiator entered the arena with shinier armor and a better scream. The crowd shifted. The chants softened. The tavern paintings faded under layers of smoke and spilled ale. Your name, once carved into wax tablets and shouted from balconies, became a shrug. Didn't he fight that bear once? No, that was the other guy. The one with the scar. They all had scars. Rome didn't do nostalgia. It did novelty. The crowd didn't want legends. They wanted fresh legends. New blood, new drama, new screams. You could be a hero on Monday, and forgotten by market day. The sand didn't care how many matches you'd won. It only remembered the last one, and even that, only until the next body hit the ground. Some tried to cling to relevance. They dyed their hair, polished their armor, trained harder, fought dirtier. Others leaned into myth, telling exaggerated tales of their past glory to anyone who'd listen and buy them a drink. A few tried to reinvent themselves. Trainers, bodyguards, even actors in mock battles, where the only thing at risk was their dignity. But most most faded. Quietly, painfully. They limped into obscurity, their bodies broken, their fame evaporated like sweat in the sun. The arena had moved on. The crowd had moved on. And the sand. The sand had already been raked smooth for the next star. Most died young, 20, 25 if lucky. Because in Rome, the spotlight was hot, the blade was sharp, and the curtain call came early. The average gladiator didn't age, he expired. He didn't retire to a villa in the countryside with a pension and a pet goat. He died in the sand, mid-scream, mid-swing, mid-sentence. The arena didn't care how many matches you'd won, how many scars you'd earned, or how many fans named their children after you. It cared about the next fight, the next roar, the next splash of red on golden sand. 20 was considered seasoned, 25, practically ancient. If you made it to 30, people assumed you were either a ghost or had bribed the gods. The body simply couldn't take it. The constant training, the brutal matches, the infections, the injuries, the stress of knowing that every time you stepped into the arena, you might be stepping into your own grave. It wore you down. It hollowed you out. It made you old before your time, if you lived long enough to be called old at all. And the deaths weren't always dramatic. Some bled out quietly in the barracks. Some collapsed during training. Some simply didn't wake up. The lucky ones died quickly, cleanly, with a sword through the heart and a crowd on their feet. The unlucky ones lingered, fevered, broken, forgotten in a corner, while the next match was already being announced. There were no memorials, no statues, no solemn processions, maybe a nod from a bunkmate, maybe a muttered curse from the Lannister for losing a good investment, maybe a new recruit assigned to your mat before the blood had dried. Because the machine didn't stop, the games didn't pause, the crowd didn't mourn. The crowd forgot your name as soon as your blood dried. Because in Rome, memory was a luxury, and gladiators were meant to be consumed. You were a moment, a cheer, a gasp, a flicker of excitement between sips of wine and bites of roasted dormice. The crowd didn't come for you. They came for what you did. And once you stopped doing it, once your sword dropped and your body stilled, you were no longer a person. You were scenery, a cautionary tale. A stain on the sand soon to be raked over and replaced. There were no statues for the fallen, no plaques, no, in memoriam, scrolls read aloud between matches. You might have been the hero of the morning bout, but by the afternoon, your name was already fading, replaced by the next fighter, the next scream, the next splash of crimson that made the crowd lean forward in their seats. Even the ones who loved you, your bunkmates, your fellow fighters, learned not to linger. Grief was a luxury they couldn't afford. They might nod as your body was dragged away. They might mutter your name under their breath, but they wouldn't speak of you for long. Because in the Ludus, death wasn't a tragedy. It was a Tuesday. And the crowd, the same people who screamed your name, who threw flowers and coins and kisses, would barely blink when you fell. They'd cheer your killer. They'd debate whether your final move was sloppy or brave. They'd argue over whether your helmet should have been sheenier. And then they'd move on. Because the games weren't about memory. They were about momentum. You were a flicker in the fire. A name shouted once, then swallowed by the roar. Dead bodies dragged away, dumped in mass graves or cheap funerary pits. Because in Rome, even death had a budget. And you weren't on it. Once the crowd had roared its last, once the sand had soaked up the final drop of blood, the cleanup began. Not with reverence, not with ceremony, but with efficiency. The fallen were dragged, sometimes by hand, sometimes by hook, out of the arena like broken props after a play. No funeral dirges, no mourning families. Just the scrape of limbs across stone, and the quiet grunt of labourers who'd done this too many times to care. The bodies were stripped of anything useful. Armor, weapons, even boots if they were still intact. These weren't mementos. They were inventory. The dead had no need for gear, and the living had no budget for sentimentality. Once stripped, the corpses were carted off to the outskirts of the city, to the Puticuli, Rome's infamous mass graves. These weren't graves in the poetic sense. They were pits, deep, wide, and reeking, dug into the earth like open mouths, waiting to swallow the nameless and the unwanted. Bodies were tossed in like refuse, layered with lime to slow the rot, then covered with dirt until the next batch arrived. There were no prayers, no inscriptions, just the quiet, indifferent churn of death's bureaucracy. Sometimes, if the pit was full or the workers lazy, the bodies were left half buried, limbs jutting from the soil like grotesque signposts. Dogs and scavengers circled. The air buzzed with flies and the stench of decay. And still, the games went on, because Rome didn't pause for corpses. It recycled them. And yet, in rare moments, tiny flickers of humanity in the machinery of spectacle, someone remembered. A bunkmate. A friend. A fellow fighter who'd shared a bowl of beans and a whispered joke before the match. If they survived, if they had a few coins, if they dared to ask the Lannister for the body, they might retrieve it. Quietly. At night, away from the eyes of the crowd. A few lucky ones buried with a small stone. If they had friends who survived to remember them. Because in Rome, memory was the only grave marker that couldn't be stolen. There were no marble tombs for gladiators. No carved epitaphs. No solemn statues with outstretched arms and poetic inscriptions. If you were lucky, truly lucky, someone who cared might sneak your body from the pit, wrap it in cloth, and bury it in a quiet corner of land. No fanfare, no priest. Just a hole in the earth and a stone to say, "He was here." That stone might bear a name, scratched in haste with a dull blade. Or maybe just a symbol, a helmet, a sword, a crude fish crest for a mamillo. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to remember. Because in a world where your life was a commodity, and your death a spectacle, being remembered was the closest thing to immortality. Sometimes fellow gladiators pooled their meager coins to pay for a proper burial. A final act of defiance. A way to say, you mattered. You were more than the crowd's roar. These makeshift funerals were quiet, hidden, and heartbreakingly human. A whispered name. A shared drink. A moment of silence before the next match. But most weren't so fortunate. Most were forgotten. Their bones mingled with others in anonymous pits, their stories erased by time and sand. The arena didn't keep records. The crowd didn't keep memories. And Rome kept moving. Yet even in that silence, some echoes remained. A scratched name, a worn stone, a tale passed from one fighter to the next. Because memory, fragile as it was, could still outlast the empire's appetite for blood. Some gladiators left children, outcasts, often forced into the same brutal trade. Because in Rome, legacy wasn't always a blessing. It was sometimes just another chain. These children were born in the shadow of the arena, their lullabies the clash of steel and the roar of the crowd. They were the sons and daughters of men who had bled for applause, who had died for spectacle, who had been both idolized and discarded. And in a society that prized lineage but loathed infamy, these children inherited the worst of both worlds. They weren't citizens. They weren't slaves. They were infames by association, tainted by bloodlines that had once thrilled the empire, but now marked them as unclean. No noble family would take them in. No guild would train them. No temple would bless them. They were ghosts in the daylight, reminders of Rome's appetite for violence and its refusal to digest the consequences. Some were sold young, their names replaced with numbers, their futures traded for coin. Others were raised in the ludi, the gladiator schools, where they learned to fight before they learned to read. They were trained by the same men who had once fought beside their fathers, men who saw in them echoes of old comrades, or worse, old failures. There was no sentimentality, only survival, and for those who tried to escape the cycle. Rome had a long memory and a short tolerance for rebellion. A child of the arena might try to become a merchant, a laborer, a soldier, but the scars, the name, the look always gave them away. Aren't you the son of that Thracian who fought the lion? Didn't your mother die in the games? You've got your father's eyes, and his limp. Some embraced it. They took up the sword, stepped into the sand, and tried to carve out a name of their own. Others were dragged into it, kicking, screaming, bleeding. But whether by choice or by force, many ended up right where their parents had fallen, beneath the sun, beneath the crowd, beneath the weight of a legacy that never asked for their consent. Because in Rome, blood was destiny, and the arena didn't care whose child you were, only how loud the crowd would cheer when you died. When the last roar faded, the Colosseum stood quiet, and in that silence the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten names whispered through the dust. The arena, once a thunderous cauldron of cheers and screams, settled into a hush so deep it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. The marble arches, scorched by centuries of sun, stood like sentinels over a battlefield long abandoned. The wind moved through the corridors, where vendors once shouted, and children once laughed, now carrying only the faint echoes of steel on steel, and the final cries of men who had no tombstones. The Colosseum didn't mourn. It remembered, not with plaques or statues, but with silence. A silence that pressed it against the stone, heavy with memory. Every crack in the wall, every worn step, every faded carving was a scar, a reminder, a whisper of a name once chanted, now lost. Tourists would one day walk its corridors, snapping photos, marveling at the architecture. But they wouldn't hear the ghosts. They wouldn't feel the weight of the sand beneath their feet, the layers upon layers of crushed bone and dried blood, compacted by time and indifference. They wouldn't know that beneath the grandeur, beneath the arches and columns, lay a graveyard without markers. The Colosseum had seen emperors rise and fall. It had outlived dynasties, plagues, and earthquakes. But it never outlived the men who died within it. They lingered. Not in spirit, perhaps, but in the very fabric of the place. In the dust that clung to the walls. In the silence that followed the last roar. The sand hid old bones, old blood, forgotten names. Because in Rome, even the earth learned to bury its shame. Layer upon layer, the arena floor became a palimpsest of pain. Each grain of sand a mute witness to 1,000 deaths. The Colosseum's surface was raked smooth after every match, but the ground remembered. Beneath the fresh layer lay yesterday's blood, and beneath that, the blood of the week before, and the month before that. It was a graveyard without markers, a reliquary of the anonymous. Time did not erase the violence, it compressed it. The bones of the fallen, shattered and scattered, were ground into the soil by the boots of the next generation of fighters. Teeth, fragments of ribs, bits of armor, swallowed by the earth like secrets too shameful to speak aloud. The sand was not just a stage, it was a sponge, a vault, a silent accomplice, and yet Rome built over it, paved it, polished it, raised marble temples and triumphal arches above it. The empire's grandeur stood on a foundation of screams. Senators debated policy in halls built with the taxes of the same citizens who once cheered for blood. Emperors dined in palaces that overlooked the very arena where men had died to keep them popular. The city gleamed. Its statues were white, its fountains clear, its roads straight and proud. But beneath the marble, beneath the mosaics and monuments, the truth remained. Buried, but not gone. The Colosseum may have fallen silent, but the ground beneath it still hummed with memory. Not loud, not angry, just present. But beneath Rome's marble and power, echoes of men who bled for cheers remain. Because no empire, no matter how gilded, can silence the ghosts it creates. The Colosseum still stands, cracked, weathered, majestic. Tourists marvel at its arches, snap selfies in its shadow, and buy miniature replicas from vendors who probably don't know a Ricci Arius from a ravioli. But the stones remember. They remember the thunder of the crowd, the clash of steel, the final gasps of men who fought not for glory, but for survival. They remember the blood that soaked the sand, the cheers that drowned out mercy, the silence that followed when the last scream faded. Rome built monuments to its greatness, but buried the cost beneath them. And though the empire fell, though centuries passed and emperors turned to dust, the arena endures. A monument not just to Roman engineering, but to Roman appetite. For spectacle, for violence, for the illusion that power is eternal. But listen closely, and you might still hear it. Not the roar of the crowd, but the whisper of names long forgotten. The ones who didn't get statues. The ones who didn't get songs. The ones who bled and died and vanished beneath the sand. Disclaimer: we've done our best to stay true to historical facts, but hey, this isn't a peer-reviewed dissertation. It's a dramatic, slightly unhinged, occasionally sarcastic retelling of a very real, very brutal part of history. Some details may be simplified, exaggerated, or lovingly embroidered with humor to keep you from dozing off mid-decimation. Now, speaking of dozing off, go to sleep. Seriously. You've just read thousands of words about ancient blood sport. Your brain deserves a nap. Dream of tridents, tigers, and toga-clad emperors giving thumbs ups with suspicious enthusiasm. And remember, if you wake up in a sandpit holding a wooden sword, run. Good night, champion of the couch.